Hello, everybody. Thank you very much for being here today with us in this afternoon. My name is Susana Ecclestone. I'm the Executive Director at the British Argentine Chamber of Commerce, and I'm very proud to have with me Jimena Blanco from Veris Maplecroft and Ezequiel Zambaglione from Balance Capital, sponsors of the BACC and great supporters. So the event here today is to talk about, the consequences or the results of the latest primaries in Argentina. So without further ado, I'm going to introduce our speakers and then we'll go straight into the topic of the day. And for those who follow what is happening in Argentina, a lot has happened since we originally planned and started thinking of this event. So Jimena leads Veris Maplecroft's Americas research team with regional and thematic experts based in Argentina, Mexico, the US, Spain, and the UK. She's the Americas expert on Brazil and the Southern Cone, and frequently provides advice to multinational companies and multilateral institutions on political risk in Latin America. Among others, Jimena has undertaken several human rights impact assessments for mining companies in the Americas. She participates in diplomatic, academic, and business forums addressing issues of regional and country-specific concern. Jimena also makes regular contributions to the British and foreign media. Prior to working for Veris Maplecroft, Jimena edited several publications at Latin News and wrote extensively on Latin America, covering political, economic, and security issues. She was also a contributor to the International Institute for Strategic Studies Special Dossier, the FARC Files, Ecuador, Venezuela, and the Secret Archive of Raúl Reyes. Jimena studied history and political science at Randolph-Macon Women's College and obtained a master's degree in Latin American Studies from the Institute for the Study of the Americas, University of London, and she's a member of the Worldwide Association of Female Professionals. Jimena, it's great to see you again, and thank you very much for being with us this afternoon. And Ezequiel Zambaglione, Ezequiel has extensive experience in Argentina's capital markets and a solid academic background. Prior to Balance, he served for more than 5 years as head of research and strategy in Puente and Max Valores, where he developed strong skills on macro strategy with focus on institutional clients. He has also worked for more than 8 years at the Central Bank of Argentina, holding different senior positions at the External Transactions and Foreign Exchange Division. Ezequiel holds a Master in Mathematics of Finance from Columbia University in the city of New York, a Master in Finance from the University Torquato Di Tella, and a bachelor degree in economics from the University of Buenos Aires. And thank you very much, Ezequiel, for being with us again. We were together a year ago when your baby was born. So excellent to have you again. So without further ado, I leave you, both of you, to start with a brief summary, and then we'll lead on to the questions. And we invite everybody to post the questions in the chat box for the end of the event, and I hope that we can have enough time to just answer all of them. So I'm going to disappear briefly. I'll leave you, all the screen for both of you, and I'll see you in the background, all right? Thank you, guys.
Great, thank you, Susana. And I guess I'll just start by doing a very brief recap of what happened this past Sunday in Argentina. We had primaries in the country, and for those of you who are not familiar with the system, primaries are mandatory in Argentina. It means all political parties have to participate on a single day. They have to pass a threshold of votes in order to participate on the actual election day, which in this case would be in November. Primaries and the actual election this year were delayed due to the pandemic, but the actual election is happening in November. And it was, we consider the primaries, or PASO as they're called in Spanish, to be the most reliable poll that we have in terms of looking at trends, voter intention, how society is feeling about their political leadership in the country at any given moment. And some interesting things to note about this exercise. Like in most countries in the region, polls were way off in Argentina before the primaries actually happened. Very few pollsters actually came close to calling the big difference or the big sway of vote that actually happened towards the opposition compared to the primaries that we had 2 years ago before the 2019 general election. Another important thing to highlight, which I just alluded to, is the result. It's one of the worst results in a primary since the primaries have been instituted for a ruling party. And if this result were to be repeated in November, the Alberto Fernandez administration would find itself weaker than it is from an institutional perspective in terms of its presence in the Chamber of Deputies, but crucially in the Senate, which the Peronist Party has not lost control of since the return of democracy in 1983. So really, we're talking about a historical potential outcome if this past Sunday's votes were repeated in November. And since then, as Susana alluded to at the beginning in her introduction, we've seen a lot of the trends that we had been expecting to play out accelerate quite quickly. And in particular, I'm talking about competition within the ruling coalition in terms of finding who is the culprit for the loss or assigning culpability for the loss, determining who's going to bring the coalition forward and take it out of this current political crisis. And this is threatening to devolve into an institutional crisis where we see the president and the vice president seemingly in open confrontation with each other after the ministers who respond to Cristina Kirchner, the VP, all handed in their resignation yesterday to President Fernandez. An important thing to keep in mind is that those resignations he can accept or reject, and he hasn't made up his mind yet. So this is very much a situation that's playing out as we're talking to you all today. So it's a really, the events are unfolding quickly in Buenos Aires, but I think it's a particularly interesting political time, which will obviously have an impact on the economy, which Ezequiel is going to tell us more about.
Hey, well, good afternoon, everyone. Yes, well, it's a tough question you left to me, but what I can say is that for sure Sunday's result was a surprise for everyone. I would say that the consensus was, in a best case scenario, a tie at national level, and the opposition got a 9-point lead. So it was a surprise. It was also a surprise the reaction in bond prices and on the FX, because I expected a positive impact, because the main risk behind bond prices in Argentina probably is a political one, the fear of the ruling party to become more radical, turning to the left, and probably avoid an agreement with the IMF, which has been in discuss over the last 2 years. So a good result for the opposition should mean higher odds of the opposition winning the election in 2023, and potentially a change in regime that should reduce that political risk. But probably markets feel what happened after that, because now we are having a kind of a political crisis within the ruling party, as Jimena said. And probably that was the fear after the election. It sounds strange, but a better result for the government could be read more positive than this result, because this result probably was expected to lead to a political crisis in the ruling coalition. My feeling is that, well, I don't share that view, because my feeling is that if the government wanted to avoid an agreement with the IMF, they probably have done that before. So I don't think this result changed much that, but it changed the probability of changing the regime in 2023. That should be good for bond prices. Right now, well, we are in the middle of a lot of uncertainty in Argentina because we had not only the political uncertainty that increased a lot over the last 2 days, we had the uncertainty about the agreement with the IMF that if the government is not able to reach an agreement, probably the impact on the economy would be really, really hard. A default with the IMF is not good for everyone, and my feeling is that the government know that, and that's why we are positive on having an agreement, at least in over the next, by the beginning of next year. But we also have a really challenging macroeconomic scenario in which we had a really large FX gap because of a lot of capital controls. The economy has collapsed last year because of the pandemic, and it has recovered this year, but now one expects a really strong economy because of the capital controls, many economic policies against investments, negative rates. So it's a really challenging scenario with a lot of pesos going around, inflation running really high. So my feeling is that the reaction, the bond prices reaction is related to the politics, but also to the economics, because a break in the ruling coalition could make it even more challenging for next year. So that's the broad scenario in Argentina right now. My view is that it's difficult to think that the ruling coalition will break and will break with negotiation with the IMF, because that would be really bad for everyone in political, economic, and social manner. And in the end, the result of the election should be good for the medium-term scenario for Argentina, and that's why we are positive at current prices. That already reflects this challenging, and probably already reflects a big crisis over the next 2 years, and potentially a new restructuring in 2 or 3 and 3 or 4 years ahead. So that's why we are positive, not because of the short-term development, which are really unpredictable, to be honest, but considering prices and medium-term expectations, we are positive on Argentina in general.
Thank you, Ezequiel. So we'll go back to that a bit later. So Jimena, what would you say are the main factors behind Sunday's results, and to what degree was, considering the changes in the last 48 hours, of course, was this an expected outcome, you think?
Well, I mean, I think for, the past 2 years, we haven't had much clarity as to, where the government was headed. If you think about it, we haven't had a real, whether it's an economic plan or a security program, or an interior program that, you could turn to and look at KPIs and see whether the government was heading in the right direction or not. The pandemic and the inheritance from the previous administration tend to be cited by the government as the main reasons why the economy collapsed last year. But for voters, the main problem is campaign promises weren't delivered on, besides the fact that there was a pandemic. And a lot of the voting base that supported Alberto Fernandez back in 2019 did so in part as punishment for the inability of the Macri administration to deliver a better economic performance, but also on the back of this promise that Alberto Fernandez was bringing a moderate, improved version of Kirchnerism, and that it wasn't a third term of Cristina Kirchner. And interestingly enough, up until today, if you'd asked me this question maybe yesterday, I would have said that we haven't seen Alberto Fernandez actually put his foot down and define he is the president and Cristina is the VP, and there's an institutional hierarchy that should be respected, right? Until today, there was very much this view in the country and outside that Cristina Kirchner decided on policy, negotiated internally within the coalition, and Alberto Fernandez was, many people have said it openly, was a puppet that was implementing her policies. That, interestingly enough, appears to be coming to an end, or at least he's sending some signals that he's willing to end that just today by saying that, the policy gets decided at the executive, that he will run his cabinet however he sees fit, that he wants to maintain the coalition, but he is going to do so by building support with other stakeholders, namely governors, mayors, social movements, that in the last 24 hours came out and expressed their support for institutional continuity. And I think all of this is, as a political scientist looking at Argentina, again, it's unprecedented. It's very interesting because the wording that we're seeing right now, if we removed who the stakeholders are, it would be a speech more likely associated with an opposition government saying, we need to finish our term, we are a coalition, we need to deliver on the term we were elected for, we respect institutional order, we need to support social peace, cohesion. Interestingly enough, this is happening under a Peronist government, and that again is a first for Argentina. So I think, what brought people to this? Discontent, disillusionment, a lot of economic hardship. We're talking about, the poverty rate increasing significantly last year, despite the government increasing spending on social programs and supporting people that were unable to work during the lockdown. So there was a large punishment vote. My concern is that the last 48 hours has done nothing but to confirm for those people who went for a punishment vote that they should punish the government, right? There hasn't been a message that clearly says the government has heard you, we will adjust, we will moderate, we will look into your claims, right? And so this really means that the government is heading for potentially a weaker 2 years ahead of it. And if it hasn't been able to deliver policy in the first 2 years, my question is, how will it do so in the next 2 years from a weaker standing? So, I think politically, the coming 2 months are going to be defining for the Alberto Fernandez term. And we may see him do something that he hasn't done since the beginning, which is to found, if you will, Albertism. So, who is Alberto Fernandez? Who is he going to get backing from? How is he going to design policy? And how is he going to be different from Cristina Kirchner if that's his long-term plan?
Wonderful. I think we've seen some of that in the news already in the last 48 hours. Now, Ezequiel, Martin Guzman is on the hot chair at the moment. And what do you think the election and the latest developments, imply for the government's economic plan and his role as Minister of Economy?
Well, he was one of apparently appointed by Cristina that Cristina suggests to leave his chair, but by the end of the day, apparently she called him and said that he was not in the list. So apparently he's gonna stay there for a while. Regarding the result and the economic program, I would say that I don't know if something changed over the last 2 days, but I would have responded this question on Monday saying that for sure from now to November we are gonna see more expansionary policies from fiscal and monetary policies, especially because of the low turnout in the election. So probably the government could be tempted to try to seduce people that didn't go to vote on Sunday with specific programs like increasing pensions or increasing social security payments or something like that. But from November and ahead, it's difficult that this could change much the political program. In fact, we don't know the program at all, but I would say that you have to reach an agreement with the IMF, and the government probably knows that, and you don't have too much options to decide, let's say, because probably the perfect program for the government is to have low rates, to have a high fiscal deficit, and probably to have tough capital controls to maintain or to avoid capital flows, but that's impossible under an agreement with the IMF. So in the end, I think the election hasn't changed much. And if it changes, my feeling is that probably it changes in favor of the IMF, because if before this election they feel like that they needed an agreement with the IMF, now after the big loss on Sunday, they know that for winning in 2023 they need a much better economy by that time. So they need even more an agreement with the IMF, and probably that agreement could be even more tough than we had expected before. But as I said, over the last 2 days, we had a lot of discussion within the ruling parties, so we really don't know what is gonna come from that mess.
We'll have to wait and see. So, Jimena, how does the result impact the Frente de Todos coalition going forward, and taking into consideration what's happened in the last 48 hours? And what is your perception of, you mentioned a little bit as the President Fernandez in particular, and his persona and his role in government?
Well, let me get out a crystal ball, right? Because I think right now, especially with what happened in the last 48 hours, we expected this, right? So we expected him fighting within the ruling coalition to emerge after the midterm elections. Nobody expected them to be this quickly and this pronounced. So I think that in itself was surprising. But I think what it does in terms of the coalition itself is the debates will now become very political and very much geared towards recovering some of the vote share for November, sorry. And I think, some policies may get shelved simply because they're not politically convenient, or they don't add any political capital or backing to the government. And in that sense, that's where maybe I'm more cautious than Ezequiel on the IMF deal. I think if the IMF deal was to add political weight to the government, they may have hurried to get it sooner. But any deal with the IMF, whether it's a restructure or a new deal, is politically toxic in Argentina for voters, right? In the view of voters. And so I think now it becomes politically a much tougher pill to swallow for the ruling coalition to reach any type of negotiation with the IMF that requires the country to implement a significant adjustment. And so I agree wholeheartedly with Ezequiel that the ruling coalition needs a much better economy heading into 2023. The question is, what is the end game after you try to balance the requirements of the IMF, your own economic model, and how you want to spend, and how do you bring those two together in a way that doesn't weaken you politically even more than what these midterms are potentially leaving behind after November.
Yes, excellent. So going back to that, I mean, and I know you do need the crystal ball, we do know that, but what would an ideal, deal with the IMF look like, Ezequiel, in your view?
Well, as Jimena said, it's difficult to place all together when you analyze or to, if you know what economists in the ruling party believe a growing program is and what the IMF believes a growing program is. So there is no match between those programs, and probably that's why we are under talks for more than a year and a half. But in the end, both knows that a default could be the worst scenario for everyone. And that's why my feeling is that the agreement is gonna be something probably softer than what typically have been, probably leaving more space for a more gradual reduction in fiscal deficit, especially because it was the government main idea around a growing program. They need to show to their voters that the state is or the public sector is big and is spending, because it's the first one in start or to push the economy, or to make the first push for the economy to start growing. I think that probably could be a point to have, I don't know, 2.5 or 2 points of primary deficit for next year, right? Or something like that, which is large in terms of a typical IMF agreement, especially under the current scenario in which there is a lot of pesos in Argentina going around, and there is a really large FX gap between the official FX and the black market effects, or the free dollar, as we call. That's why I would expect that. But on the other hand, you need to accumulate reserves in some way, and that's the main difficulty for the agreement, in my view, because you have, as I said, a large FX gap that is putting a lot of pressure on your balance of payments. As a reference, we are living in a almost record high commodity prices. The exports this year are going to be one of the highest in Argentina's history, and the central bank probably is going to end the year losing reserves. So that's because everyone in Argentina is trying to grab dollars at the official FX, because it's worth half of what the actual dollar worth in the other market, in the bonds market. So my feeling that's the main discussion in Argentina, but I would say that the program is going to look like a 1 or 2 year program to be reviewed again in 2023, just a kind of surviving program, not a program to solve structural problems in Argentina, just to go through a monetary crisis or a balance of payment crisis over the next 2 years. So that's the best they can get, in my view, considering all the restrictions from the government and from the IMF, right?
Wonderful. Thank you, Ezequiel. Jimena, your data shows that protests have been increasing in recurrence and since late 2020. And we know that something is brewing at the moment. How do you expect this content and governability to evolve in the coming year, in the next few days or weeks?
Yeah, I mean, when we look, for anyone who's not familiar with Maplecroft, we produce a series of indices, and two of the key indices for us are government stability and civil unrest, which put together we consider to be our political stability index. And something interesting that's happened over the last 48 hours is that to the growing number of protests that we've seen over the past year, we now add in fractures within the cabinet. We now add in policy paralyzation in Congress. And so from our perspective, when we look at political stability, which we define as a government's ability to implement policy and people's acceptance of that policy, or alternatively, if you want to look at it the other way, their demonstrations against those policies on the streets, we're now seeing a worsening of the situation in both of those indicators because of what's happening with the government and also what's happening on the streets, right? However, I think there's an important player we haven't mentioned yet, and that would be the opposition, right? And I think we shouldn't just assume that the strong result on Sunday was an endorsement of the opposition necessarily, or that a significant amount of the Argentine electorate turned pro-market, pro-business over a 2-year period, right? For the opposition, the key challenge now, of course, the opposition has been watching from the sidelines now. There's no need to rock the boat if the ruling coalition is having a pretty open confrontation. But the opposition will have to show that it is a responsible opposition, that it's able to turn that controller role that it would have in Congress into a viable ticket for 2023 that would enable it to come back to government. So I think, you know, we shouldn't just assume that because the opposition had a very strong showing this past Sunday, that there will be a change in government 2 years from now. I mean, if anything, the last week has shown us that a week can be a very long time in Argentina, 2 years can be a bit of an eternity. So anything can happen between now and 2023. You know, we don't even know who the actual candidates will be. But I think that's, you know, the other side is how disruptive or how constructive will the opposition be if after November, well, after December rather, when the new Congress would take office next March, we see Alberto Fernandez, you know, having a minority bloc in both the Senate and the lower house, right? That would give the opposition tremendous responsibility from a governability standpoint.
Well, that's an interesting point. So for both of you, and then we'll open to questions. So please pose your questions if you have any. We have a few here already. For both of you, what would be the best possible scenario considering what has happened in the last 48 hours leading on to November? Be realistic with the reality that we know is always changing in Argentina and the current players that we have at the moment. Open to both of you.
Okay, I can start if you want, Jimena. I would say that the best scenario, probably it's not going to happen, but should be Cristina stepping back, showing a picture with Fernandez to solve this kind of internal crisis, and leave Fernandez to build his cabinet again, probably using more guys related to the center or more moderate political approach, and going through, as I said, an agreement with the IMF, more orthodox policies, that everything together with the recent election should bring risk premiums down and make it easier for the country to move forward and to start growing again and release some financial pressure. Probably that's the best case scenario. I don't think that's gonna happen because Cristina has a strong personality. So maybe the best scenario, the best possible scenario would be Cristina remaining at the shadows, to say in a way, leaving Alberto to build his cabinet as he wish, without asking apologies, of course, and probably she and her coalition, La Cámpora, keep sending darts to the president every time they can, but at least leaving him to take the calls. Because my view is that in the end, Cristina, well, the message we sent today was all or nothing, right? She wanted to take full control or to have no responsibilities at all. So the signal is to make it very clear for everyone that she is not agree with what happened or the decisions the president are taking or have taken so far. So given that message, she probably is expecting that stepping back until 2023, let Alberto to face the really challenging scenario for Argentina, and coming back probably thinking that he's not gonna fix the problem with a even more problematic scenario, and trying to get back the power through the next election. That's my view.
Jimena?
Yeah, I mean, I think in terms of what's best for the country would be that Alberto Fernandez is able to finish his term with a coalition behind him, and not a fractured coalition working against him, and an opposition as well to challenge him. I mean, I think after that, it becomes wishful thinking in terms of, you know, asking for clear policy path or programs, because if we haven't seen them in the first half of the administration, I doubt we're going to see them in the second half. But I think more clarity as to who's calling the shots and how far Alberto Fernandez is willing to give in order to maintain the coalition united will be, you know, a top concern for any investor looking at the country right now. So I think, you know, we can only hope that the crisis that's unfolding right now gets resolved within institutional means, and as well with a coalition that can still, you know, resolve its differences together, and gives President Fernandez the stability he needs to get on with the challenge of the second half of his administration.
Wonderful. I'm turning the camera back on now. Thank you both. We have a few questions here. Some of the questions have been partially answered, but I open the questions to both of you. So whoever wants to take, you know, the initiative and answer, let me know. I have a question from Colin Lewis. Colin, hello. Sunday's vote for the opposition was surprisingly high. Was it a vote for the opposition or a vote against the government? Turnout on Sunday was the lowest ever recorded. What can the administration or the opposition do to encourage the 1/3 of voters who did not turn out to turn out on the 14th of November and vote for them?
If I take the first part, I agree. I think it's implicit in the question. A lot of that vote was against the government rather than in favor of the opposition. In terms of turnout, yes, it's true. It was the lowest turnout of a primary and of any election. But I think if you look at the trends, generally primaries have lower turnout than election day. Interestingly, or maybe challenging for the government, is to convince those voters to vote for them, because the historic trend shows that people who turn out to vote on election day that didn't go to the primaries tend to vote for the opposition. We saw that big swing of votes or big increase in votes for Macri in 2019, which reduced the gap that we had seen between the primaries and actual election day. The big challenge we have now in the context of the pandemic is, as you know, voting in Argentina is mandatory, and there's certain exceptions or exemptions under which you cannot vote. But the pandemic has thrown in basically a carte blanche for anyone who doesn't want to vote, which is, close contact with someone who has COVID, potential symptoms, etc. So you just fill in a form online and you just don't go. And when we look at systems that have gone from mandatory voting to optional voting, say Chile as a very recent regional example, we see participation plummet quite quickly. And I think the pandemic is in a way giving that opportunity to people who don't want to participate to just fill out a form online and not participate in the election. So I think that's an uphill battle, both for the government and for the opposition.
Ezequiel, any comments on that? You are muted.
Sorry. Well, I would like to ask just that for me, it's really difficult to understand the distribution of the people that didn't go to vote. I'm not sure if it's gonna be similar to what happened in previous elections, because this time, as Jimena said, the pandemic was in between, so it's difficult to understand for which the coalition they will vote, right? But looking at some numbers, when you look through the different provinces and the different districts of the province of Buenos Aires, for example, turnout was similar in everywhere. It's not about, districts like La Matanza, for example, in which the government have typically double or triple, three times the votes than the opposition. The participation or the turnout was lower. No, it was almost the same across the country. So that could signal that the distribution of these potential new voters could be similar to the one we saw in the election. And the other number I would like to point is, when you look at the total numbers the Juntos por el Cambio obtained, they were really similar to the ones they obtained in the PASO of 2017. Even a couple of votes, they got a couple of more votes than in 2017, despite there were more than 1 million people more than one people less. More than one people less. There were more than 1 million less voters these times. So if you try to extrapolate, saying, well, the new voters are going to split 50 and 50, Juntos por el Cambio would end up with 11.5 million voters, something like that, against the around 10 million voters they got in the general election in 2017. So when you see those numbers, it looks like probably it's not clear if there were a change in the way people vote, or probably there were more guys from the ruling party that didn't go to vote, because 10 million voters was the best election ever for Juntos por el Cambio in the general, with 80% turnout in 2017. The only thing I could say to go back to this idea of the same distribution of the new voters is that in 2017, Massa, now in the Frente de Todos, got more than 1 million votes. So probably that those voters are now in the Juntos por el Cambio coalition, and that could be an explanation of this increase in the amount of total voters. So I would say that I do not expect a change in the result for November, and in fact, if turnout increased to 80%, the government would need 70% of those voters to go to vote for them to end up in a tie election. So my feeling is the cards are over the table, and probably the crisis we are seeing in the ruling coalition is a signal of that. They threw the election with this reaction, practically accepting the loss, right?
Right, that's interesting. A question from Alex. Few governments have come through this COVID period strongly. Are these results perhaps exaggerated by this? And how much of this sentiment will be relevant or remembered in 2023 in the face of the usual election tactics?
I'll say very quickly, yes, I agree wholeheartedly. We've seen incumbents falling and getting punished across the region. One positive to highlight here, I would like to say, is that Argentina has maintained its channels to express discontent intact, right? Voters in Argentina use the ballot box to punish the government. We haven't seen violent demonstrations, we haven't seen looting, we haven't seen, right? So I think, which we have seen in other countries in South America in the past year in the context of the pandemic. So I think that, in itself is positive. Again, 2023 is very far away. As Ezequiel was talking, I was hearing that, potentially Interior Minister Guado de Pedro, his resignation has been accepted now. So the situation is unfolding very quickly. And to think about, who may stand to gain from this 2 years from now, it's just way too soon. So I think for me, the key aspect is not only what happens with the government, but also how does the opposition manage this, if you will, advantage position it's finding itself in, and whether it's able to capitalize on that, or something we haven't mentioned so far, whether we have an outsider, something we haven't considered in Argentina in previous elections, which has happened across the region as well, have an outsider candidate who is able to reap the benefits of discontent with established political parties and elites.
The fractures that we have at the moment. Yeah, definitely. Ezequiel, anything on that?
Oh, just to say that what this election and the previous one made clear for us is that the economy is really important in the election. We saw the same people voting Macri in 2015, voting Macri again in 2017, then voting Fernandez, and now voting the Juntos por el Cambio again. So I agree that it's impossible to project this result to 2023, but what I can say is that it's difficult to imagine a much better economy by 2023 than today, considering the big macroeconomic challenges that Argentina has. So that's the only thing I have to say.
Yeah, and I have a question on that from Celia. Hello, Celia. How will Geneva, I cannot pronounce his name properly, Georgieva, be able to stand in front of the IMF board and defend a soft agreement with Argentina? How responsible is the budget presented by Guzman indicating 33% inflation in 2020 and 4% growth? If Fernandez needs to keep spending and money can only come from the printing machines in the central bank, how is Guzman thinking inflation will come down from the current 50% to 33%? Excellent question.
Yeah.
To both of you.
I can start to answer that. Regarding the board, the IMF board, I agree with you. It's difficult to imagine the IMF accepting this kind of deal, but considering the long negotiations we have seen, and I think, as I said, probably they are thinking this as a bridge to the next agreement or something like that, because if they push for a more tough agreement and the country end up in a big crisis again, I don't think the IMF wants that, because we had a dark history with the IMF, especially in 2001, and I really don't know. It's just my feeling. I don't have information about what's happening inside the IMF, but they are already involved. They don't have to put more money on the country, and my feeling is that they prefer to sign a program that could avoid the country to go into or to have a high likelihood of avoiding the country going into a crisis, but not being responsible or pointed out from the government for being the responsible of the crisis. I'm not sure about that, but that's the best answer I can give. And regarding the budget, well, it happens every time because we have in Argentina a law in which if you have more resources than what it is in the budget, you can spend it as you want. So what the government usually does is to underestimate the inflation, underestimate growth, to ending up with higher revenues in the next year and be able to spend more discretionally. I don't think Guzman thinks that the target of 33% inflation is accurate for next year. Maybe he does, but the IMF will not accept that budget. I think it's more related to politics than to an actual economic program.
Jimena, any comments on that? We have more questions coming in.
Just very briefly on the IMF, I think given the size of the standby agreement with Argentina, it's as much the IMF's problem as it is Argentina's. And so I think that's, that is a big selling point for internal conversations in the IMF as to why do you keep talking to Argentina? Because, it is the biggest standby agreement in IMF history. So there is also vested interest from creditors to get their money back.
Yeah, definitely. I agree. From Cristobal, we have another question. Do you think the fragmentation within the ruling parties, fragmentation is related with the regional trend? For example, in Peru, the ruling party is divided between radicals and more moderates. In Chile, Vamos coalition has also been fractured. Do you think this is just part of a historic trend, or is partly fragmentation worsening in the current times?
So, I guess the brief answer I would say is no, in the sense that the Peruvian political system is probably the most fragmented in all of Latin America and has been for years now. I think it's extremely different from the Argentine political system in terms of, the presence of national parties that you have in Argentina that is almost non-existent in Peru. The large parties that did exist are effectively defunct. I think it's also very different from the Chilean system because of its history, because of the history of the Chilean system and the political reform that happened under the second Bachelet government, which is opening the door for the first time, basically, for independents and smaller parties to form coalitions and move away from the two big coalitions. I think if anything, Argentina is in a way going against the regional trend in the sense that it's forming coalitions quite late on, right? If we look at the political history of the 20th century, beginning of the 21st, the country, its experiments with coalitions were very toxic, and it tended to avoid coalitions. Macri's was the first one to finish a term in over 100 years. So, I think in a way, Argentina is coming into the coalition party, if you will, quite late in its history, especially when you compare it to, say, Chile, Uruguay, or even Brazil, which is a presidential system that often works as a parliamentary one, and the president depends on a congressional coalition to implement policy. So I think Argentina is quite different in that sense from the other countries in South America.
Ezequiel, any comments on that? And I have the two last questions from Juan.
Oh, I think I'm going to pass this one.
Okay, good, excellent. Jimena, from Juan, how likely do you see the international investors' confidence in Argentinian agricultural projects in the next months?
Well, it's still the one sector that's attracting a lot of interest, just simply because of the country's competitive advantage and, as Ezequiel mentioned, commodity prices. I think that the key concern for any investor is, often when we're looking at resource nationalism, we tend to think about mining and oil and gas. In the case of Argentina, a lot of the government's intervention in the economy and moves to take more revenue from productive sectors is related to agriculture, much more so than mining and oil and gas, simply because of the participation that the sector has in the economy and in exports. If I were advising an investor in agriculture right now, I think it's very much a wait and see where policy is going and whether there will be a greater move to take more revenue from a key productive sector, or whether the government is looking for revenue elsewhere. And at the moment, we haven't seen any signals as to where that revenue would come from if it's not from agriculture.
Excellent, thank you. And for Ezequiel, Argentina has no reserves. Where in the 450 billion GDP budget do you think the money to pay the IMF come from, excluding narco traffic and the billions deposited outside during Kirchner's government? Okay,
well, I would say that that's why the country needs an agreement, because the country doesn't have the money to pay the loan, right?
Which is what we discussed before. So thank you very much, everybody. We have no further questions. I think we should plan on a follow-up event when we have more certainty on what is going to happen, and hopefully everything will resolve for the good of the country, the investors, and the economy. But I think we are quite used to these kind of situations as Argentines, and we adapt quickly. So hopefully we'll have some results, some conclusions pretty quickly and soon. But yes, just hold that thought, because probably we'll have you soon with us again. Thank you, everybody who attended with us today, this afternoon. We'll have this video on our YouTube channel. And thank you, Jimena and Ezequiel, for your time, and your expertise is always welcome and appreciated. Have a good afternoon. Bye-bye.
Thank you. Bye. Bye to everyone.